Okay. Great. So I will now introduce our presenter for this evening, Eric Stephen. Eric is a fourth-year PhD student in the study of religion at Harvard. His work brings together American religious history and American legal history to study the role of the law in shaping public understandings of religious liberty in the United States. In his dissertation, Eric focuses in particular on how language around the secular was invoked in American legal and political discourse in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and how new ideas about the secularism and secularity that emerged during this time had a role in influencing both what Americans popularly understood the term religion to mean, and also the different visions of the appropriate role of religion in civic life that developed as a result. So with that, Eric, do you want to take it over?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mark and Camila and Lisa for organizing, and Lisa for reading my run-on sentence of an introduction. I'm going to quickly share my screen. All right, is this visible for everyone? All right, awesome. So I'm really excited to get to talk tonight about some of the religious responses that we've been seeing to COVID-19 and how they are similar to or different from the 1918 flu epidemic. And this actually kind of came about because this semester I was TFing a course that was a kind of introduction to religion and politics in the United States course that was kind of organized chronologically. And right when we moved to the digital version of this class in the second part of the semester was around the time when we got into the 20th century, which was right around when the flu pandemic broke out. And so for section, I tried to kind of organize some ways to kind of connect the flu pandemic to COVID-19. And so this kind of emerges from that. And I'm excited to be able to kind of share this a little bit more and then expand upon some of the conversations that we had in that course and bring it into a broader conversation. Just as a quick note for how I'm going to be laying out this presentation. So there's going to be first, I'm going to go through kind of a quick framing on the study of religion. And then I'm going to kind of contextualize the historical moment of 1918, what was going on politically, what was going on theologically, what was going on transnationally. And then from there, we'll really get to the good stuff, the comparing religious responses to the 1918 pandemic and COVID-19. I will say for these first two bullet points, I'm going to try to go a little bit faster so that we can really get to the comparative work. But if there's any questions on anything from the kind of historical framing or from the theological conversations that I'm going to broach pretty briefly in those sections, please let me know and we can definitely engage them a little bit more in the Q&A as well. But really briefly, kind of, I know whenever I tell folks kind of that I work in religious studies, one of the first questions that I get asked is, what is religious studies? What is the academic study of religion? And so I thought it might be useful to kind of quickly preface with a little bit of information about what it means to kind of study religion from an academic lens. This clip art is obviously a clip art of me before I made a number of weird hair decisions during self-isolation. But just to kind of quickly go over thinking about the academic study of religion, which is definitely an enormously diverse field methodologically and theoretically, and I think that even kind of leads to a degree of hand-wringing among religious studies scholars. But I think kind of the largest component of religious studies that we see today and the dimensions of religious studies that I work in are very strongly informed by fields like critical theory or cultural studies. And what they do is attempt to kind of look at those aspects of the human experience that get named religion, and how those things that get named religion kind of shape and inform and constrain things like politics or ethics, or even down to kind of our everyday experiences of the world, our understandings of ourselves, our understandings of one another. And so we can think of this as kind of similar to, for example, a gender studies program that looks at how categories of gender and discourses about gender shape and inform the human experience, or a critical race studies program that does similar work with regard to race. In religious studies, we're asking those same types of questions about the category of religion and the discourses surrounding religion as a category. I've also found really helpful, HDS's Religious Literacy Project highlights 3 principles to frame the academic study of religion. And I think kind of looking at these, they come across as somewhat intuitive, but I think it's really important for us to kind of keep them in mind as we move into looking at 1918 and today. The first being that religious traditions are internally diverse rather than uniform. And so this means that we really want to refrain from kind of saying some things like all Muslims X, or all Buddhists Y, all evangelicals Z, that there's going to be an internal diversity within any religious tradition that we're talking about. The second premise, that religious traditions change over time rather than exist as ahistorical or static. And so we need to think of religious traditions as situated in their historical moment and kind of talk about them in relation to their historical context. And then finally, that religious traditions are embedded into a broader cultural system. I think it's really important to kind of pause on this one for a moment, because I think it's kind of saying 2 things for us. The first is that kind of in contrast to the notion that, this is in contrast to the notion that religious traditions are discrete or isolated or somehow kind of private and individual and personal dimensions of human life. We want to kind of push away from that perception and that kind of understanding of religious study, of religion, and move more towards an understanding of religious traditions as embedded into a broader cultural system, as part of a broader historical moment. And the second, by saying that religious traditions are embedded into a broader cultural system, we're also saying something about the category of religion itself, which is that the category of religion is one that is socially constructed and unstable and shifts over time. And so the idea that we can kind of take a cultural system and pull out particular dimensions of it and then name it as religion is something that emerged in a particular historical context, and something that kind of developed over the course of human history into a global phenomenon, largely through imperialism. There's a religious studies scholar, Tomoko Masuzawa, who has a book titled The Invention of World Religions. And I think kind of if you shook me awake at 3 a.m. and said kind of what's the best book in religious studies right now, I would say that one, because it really gives a sense of kind of talking about religion as a socially constructed category and the role that the creation of that category and the exportation of that category has on human life, geopolitics, ideas of ethics is one that's really, really profound. And so thinking about religious studies as the study of diverse forms of devotional expression, and then keeping these 3 premises in mind, I think will help us as we go through some of these examples. And as I go through the examples, comparing 1918 to today, I'm going to try to bring up each of these premises at various points as well. So they'll be on our radar for us as we move forward. So with that kind of background in mind, I wanted to spend a little bit of time contextualizing 1918. And there were kind of 4 different components of the historical moment of 1918 that I wanted to work through. The first is the religious makeup of the US in 1918. And I really waffled on this slide for a while, largely because demographic information and kind of quantitative numbers about religion and religious diversity in the US is, 1, notoriously difficult to pin down, and 2, notoriously unhelpful for a lot of folks, including me, who's kind of working as a historian. Part of this is because in the United States, the census doesn't provide a question about religious identity, which has its a whole kind of political history that's really interesting in its own right. But 2, because affiliation doesn't really say much about practice. One could identify with a particular tradition without engaging deeply with it. One could engage deeply with a tradition without saying that they identify with that tradition. And so there are kind of a number of limitations that come up when we try to think about American religion through demographics and numbers. But just to kind of provide a little bit of context, if it's helpful at all, kind of taking it with a grain of salt. But this kind of gives us a little bit of a breakdown of the United States in the early 1900s. And this data comes from the World Religion Database. A couple kind of notes to qualify this. The first is that we see on the top left-hand corner here in green that 96% of Americans at this time were identifying as Christian in some capacity. That said, however, about 25% of that number didn't list, according to the data that was used by this organization, any sort of formal affiliation. So this could mean that it's somebody in a very rural area practicing a alone, not participating in a religious community. It could be somebody who, names themselves as Christian but doesn't go to services or doesn't kind of engage with the Christian tradition in meaningful ways. But I think this would all be to kind of say we have an overwhelming percentage of the American population that's at the very least informed by the Christian tradition. This breaks down a little bit more into 14% Catholic at this time, 48% mainline Protestant, and that's a term we're going to come back to, and 56% evangelical. And again, kind of looking at these numbers right away, you'll see that they add up to more than 100%. And this is largely because there's a huge kind of intersection between people who are identifying as mainline Protestant and those who are identifying as evangelical. These numbers in red give us information from 2015 as well, which is the most recent year that this organization was collecting data. Again, we're seeing kind of a number of important differences, but again, things that we need to take with a grain of salt in a number of ways. So for example, the relative percentage of Americans who identify as Jewish between the early 1900s and today goes down by 0.3%. But the population also expands dramatically. So 2% of Jewish Americans in the early 1900s is about 1.5 million. 1.7% today is about 5.2 million. And so the number of people who are identifying with these traditions, even if they remain small, is a lot larger in kind. Other numbers to kind of keep in mind today, about 1.9% of Americans identify as Muslim, about 1.3% identify as Buddhist, and that doesn't include a number of Americans who are informed by Buddhist traditions in various ways but don't identify as Buddhist. Today, we have an increasing number of people who are identifying as non-religious, whether that's kind of formally atheist or agnostic or just kind of a form of religious indifference. That number rose from under 1% in the early 1900s to 13.5% in the 2010s. A lot of that was coming from people who had previously identified with or grew up in mainline Protestant traditions, which can be attributed to part of this numerical decline here. But I think kind of rather than focusing on demographics alone, what might be more helpful for us to ask is how power and resources are allocated in the US along religious lines at this time. Something that's been really helpful for me in kind of thinking about that question is an argument from a historian named David Sahat, who essentially makes this argument that even though the United States has a formal separation of church and state built into the First Amendment, for a vast majority of American history, and arguably even up to today, American politics and American laws have been profoundly shaped by what gets called a de facto moral establishment. So Sahat's argument is essentially that kind of the way that our politics are organized creates the conditions for a kind of Protestant moralism to be dominant in the US, regardless of its numerical dominance. And that really is coming from this group on the bottom left-hand corner, these mainline Protestants. Mainline, notoriously wonky term, doesn't have an easy definition. Definition changes over time, but we can loosely think of the term mainline as referring to groups like Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians, kind of those who are making up the kind of central religious demography of American Protestantism. And what's particularly important to kind of note about this early 20th century moment, these early 1900s, is that the reason mainline Protestant becomes a at least mildly helpful category of analysis at this time is because there was an increased interest in interdenominational engagement across lines of Protestant difference throughout the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. So this isn't kind of full-blown interfaith engagement, but this is increasing engagement with different Protestant denominations. Some of those Protestant denominations get excluded. Pentecostals, Latter-day Saints are not involved in this kind of mainline conversation. But those who are involved in this mainline conversation think about this kind of idea of non-sectarian Christianity, so a general set of moral values formed by Christianity, regardless of your denomination, that can and should shape American policymaking, American laws, American political participation. Also important to note that this was very stratified along racial lines at this time. Mainline Protestants, white mainline Protestants that kind of make up that core of the de facto moral establishment in America were not in deep conversation with majority Black or exclusively Black congregations like AME or AMEZ. These are very, very demographically large denominations in the United States, predominantly African American, but because of the dynamics of race and the dynamics of racism in the United States during the early 1900s, a white mainline Baptist is more likely to be in conversation with, say, a white mainline Presbyterian or white mainline Baptist at this time than somebody who's African American of their same faith tradition, of their same denomination. And so we want to keep in mind those power dynamics and that kind of allocation of resources and power in the United States during this time as well. This gets us to the second point, which is the new theological divides that are emerging during this time. And again, I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly, and I'm more than happy to come back to it and talk about it a little bit more in Q&A if that is of interest to folks. But an important kind of thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about the history of religion in the United States is that the period from roughly the 1870s to the 1910s is often described as the golden age of liberal theology. Here we want to kind of qualify what we mean by the term liberal. I think kind of in our current kind of culture wars context, we have a tendency to think of liberal theology as mapping perfectly onto liberal politics and conservative theology as mapping perfectly onto conservative politics. But for a large swath of American religious history, that wasn't necessarily the case. And in many ways, the kind of liberal theology of the late 1800s and early 1900s was supporting what we would today understand to be conservative positions. Prohibition being a really, really kind of overt example here. That kind of liberal theological claims get used and utilized to support prohibition, the prohibition against alcohol in the United States, which lasted through the 1920s. And so we want to kind of keep in mind that when we talk about liberal theology, we're not necessarily saying liberal politics, but rather liberal theological claims, which are informed by kind of ideas like emphasis on the ethical dimensions of faith over the revelatory aspects, and also a general willingness to countenance what gets called modernism. So modernism is a really key theological term for this period. And this is, again, a kind of really complex term. It gets used in art in particular ways, it gets used in philosophy in particular ways, but at the very least, kind of how we think about it in theology is an attempt to kind of reconcile the Christian faith with new forms of knowledge, with new philosophical and ethical ideas, with new technological innovations. So this is a time when kind of Darwinism really hits the scene, where technological innovations in geology begin creating kind of intellectual claims and knowledge claims that directly contest the book of Genesis. And historical criticism and higher criticism are terms that get used to describe the process by which people begin to think of the Christian Bible as a historical document that can be read and analyzed with the tools of history, with the tools of literary theory, the exact same way that you would read and analyze something like Shakespeare or Plato. And so these become really contested debates politically, ethically, and theologically. And I have on kind of the right-hand side here a breakdown of kind of a spectrum that we can kind of loosely think about as different theological responses and new theological divides that emerge out of it. The first I'm not going to talk about at all, just because we're going to try to stay focused within religious responses. But I think whenever we talk about American religious history, there might be a tendency to think that because we're focusing on religious ideas, that religious ideas were 100% omnipresent everywhere in American life. And we want to keep in mind that there are those who are rejecting Christianity specifically and religion broadly as well, including freethinkers and other modernists. This is a picture of Robert Ingersoll, the great infidel of the late 1800s, who was kind of very famous for his lecture circuits critiquing Christian pastors. And then the modernists were those that we can kind of think of as these religious liberals, those who were in general agreement with modernist precepts, a vast, vast majority of mainline Protestants, Reform Judaism, and then also what gets called in Catholic theological thought, Americanism, which actually gets critiqued by the papacy as heretical in 1899. It says that these kind of ideas about modernism that can get built into Catholic theological thought, predominantly in the United States, are heretical ideas that the papacy wants to stand against. It goes a little bit further even, and in 1907, Pope Pius X promulgates an encyclical that's titled On the Doctrines of the Modernists, that officially calls out modernism, names it specifically, and says that it is heterodoxical, so it's against the formal teachings of the Catholic Church. So while we do have a number of Catholic modernists in the United States, Americanists in the United States, we also have a really significant chilling effect on modernism in Catholic theological thought because of the criticisms that are coming out of the Vatican in this early 1900s period. Other examples of religious conservatives that are kind of pushing back against modernism, I think kind of in less overt ways, Pius X is explicitly naming modernism, explicitly coming back against it, but other groups are also kind of moving away from modernism, even if they're not explicitly naming and critiquing it. So this little collage is a collage of the origins of Pentecostalism in the United States. This is going to become a major theological tradition in the 21st century. On the top left-hand corner, you can see William J. Seymour, who led the Azusa Streets Revival in Los Angeles in 1906. That is kind of often seen as one of the kind of most significant moments popularizing Pentecostalism in the United States. Below him is Amy Semple McPherson, standing next to her gospel car. She actually comes into the mix a little bit later than the time we're talking about. She's in the early 1920s, but she creates what is often seen as the first megachurch, also in Los Angeles, and then is also one of the first preachers to utilize the radio. So becomes a major figure prefiguring the development of what gets called televangelism, and especially megachurch televangelism, which is particularly popular in recent decades. And then finally, we have people taking on strong anti-modernist ideas, including groups that are called fundamentalists. And I want to kind of spend a minute on that term as well, because it's a little bit different than the term that we use, how we use that term today. So the term fundamentalism actually derives from the publication of a 12-volume series of essays called The Fundamentals that were published between 1910 and 1915. And this led to the development of kind of militantly anti-modernist form of white Protestant evangelicalism. You have a political cartoon here from fundamentalists looking at the kind of descent of the modernists, essentially saying that kind of by rejecting any of the fundamental truths of Christianity, the quote unquote fundamental truths, you essentially kind of unleash a parade of horribles that eventually leads to atheism. And so we must militantly guard these fundamentals of our faith. And this includes things like biblical inerrancy. There's no errors in the Bible. Biblical literalism. Aspects of the Bible must be read literally rather than figuratively or allegorically. And then supernaturalist dimensions of the Christian faith, the virgin birth, resurrection. While those are starting to become downplayed in modernist circles, they become really, really central to fundamentalist critiques of modernism. So again, huge range of responses, both within a particular theological tradition and then also across theological traditions. We can begin to see kinds of patterns of responses, but we always want to keep in mind that internal diversity and that historical dynamism is always at play here. So this also gets us to kind of the progressive era and World War I. So the progressive era, roughly the 1890s to the 1910s, a response to the political corruption and economic equality from the Gilded Age, which was the decades immediately following the Civil War. The social gospel movement, so again, this kind of de facto moral establishment allows for white modernist mainline Protestants to have a disproportionate say in political engagement. And this was a time in which a lot of that was kind of channeled into applying modernist theology and Christian ethics to solving social problems. And there's a kind of a number of assumptions built into that, right? Humanity is inherently good. There's an optimism towards human progress. There's a belief that human beings have a role in creating the kingdom of God on earth. And so this is more than kind of just a theological set of claims, but informs a number of assumptions about humanity, about human agency, about the nature of history and the unfolding of history. And this gets us to World War I. This is a long quote from Matthew Avery Sutton's book, American Apocalypse, where he really persuasively makes the argument that World War I represented a turning point in American religious history, where the kind of progressive era optimism gets really, really significantly curtailed, and anxieties about the World War create or legitimate a kind of conservative response to this optimism that sees the world as careening towards an inevitable apocalypse. And I think this is particularly important in that last paragraph. Over the last 150 years, this particular approach to reading the Bible, seeing it as a roadmap through the coming apocalypse, has become so pervasive among evangelicals that it is now a fundamental way in which many read the Bible. This is going to be really, really significant when we get pandemics in both 1918 and today. Theologically, this gets termed dispensational premillennialism, and a lot of dispensational premillennialists are very obsessed with kind of trying to name the different dispensations or eras of human history. Without kind of going into all of the theology of that, I thought this chart was particularly interesting just because of its title. I think it really names kind of the failure of man as a kind of pessimism that is a rejection of all of this social gospel modernist optimism about humanity and the human experience. And then finally, so a lot of prefacing, and I know I'm going very fast with it, but finally, I just wanted to kind of quickly go over exactly what happened in 1918 and 1919 with the H1N1 outbreak. In the United States, as well as a number of places globally, we see 3 waves of the H1N1 outbreak beginning in spring of 1918 and going up through spring of 1919. I have the global estimates and the US statistics listed here. Because epidemiology was in a much earlier phase during this time, these numbers are less confident than epidemiological data from later periods in the 1900s and into today. But we have at least kind of rough estimates for how significant this pandemic was, and was kind of one of the deadliest pandemics in modern human history on a global scale. In the United States in particular, though, this is all to say too, I'll be focusing on wave 2, which is the deadliest wave of the pandemic. Wave 1 began in March of 1918 in the United States. It was mostly localized, first in Fort Riley, Kansas. But this gives us an example of something that's going to be a recurring theme throughout this, which is that military bases and the military movement from World War I were very significant for the dissemination and spread of the H1N1 virus throughout 1918 and into 1919. This first wave, though, was a lot less deadly than later waves. There's actually an estimate that in the spring of 1918, about 75% of French troops were infected, but the death rate was similar to that of a standard flu, and so not much was thought of it as a particularly deadly pandemic in any way. Then we get to wave 2. Epidemiological tracing suggests that we can kind of bring this wave to a series of ships that left out of Plymouth, England, in late August, early September of 1918. Ships went into Brest in France, so into continental Europe, into Freetown, Sierra Leone, so the African coast, and then also into Boston. And this led to, these were carrying a mutated strain of the H1N1 virus that led to a much larger outbreak that took on global levels. In the United States in particular, October becomes the deadliest month for the pandemic. And so this is the period, the September, October, November is a window in which we see most deaths occurring as a result of the H1N1 virus. It's also during this time that it begins to be called the Spanish flu. Interestingly, this is not because it originated in Spain or because it was most deadly in Spain, but it was because Spain was one of the few European countries who was neutral during World War I and did not place limitations on freedom of the press like we see in other parts of continental Europe, in the UK, and in the United States. Because there was more freedom of the press, there was more reporting of the flu outbreak, and so it appeared that it was particularly deadly in Spain. Throughout this presentation, though, I'm going to stick with WHO naming guidelines to avoid locational titles. So I'm going to continue calling it the H1N1 outbreak or the H1N1 pandemic. But even I was actually just looking at an AP US history textbook that I have on my desk, and they even have Spanish flu listed as a bolded term from the chapter of the early 1800s. So that's still a prevalent description of it, but we should be moving away from these locational designations, and I'm going to keep referring to it as the H1N1 pandemic. Here's a fun little graph distribution of some of the major cities that were affected. Again, we can see that first column, that September through November, the deadliest wave. And we even see actually Cambridge as one of the most affected cities, largely because as a suburb of Boston, there was more community spread into that area before quarantining started and self-isolation started. But as the flu began to pick up, you see in the news clipping below, influenza epidemic closes schools, churches, theaters. We do see the same isolation and quarantining during this time that we are seeing also today. The third wave, a lot more isolated, largely because World War I had ended in November of 1918, and so troop movement was a lot lower. And so although this third wave was just as deadly, it was more clustered within particular cities and geographic locations, more so than the spread that we saw in wave 2. Great. So I tried to go fast. It took me longer than I was hoping to. I was going to pause here for a couple clarifying questions. Maybe if there's small informational clarifying questions, I could answer one or two before blazing ahead. But really jumping in, these are some of the main themes I'm going to talk about when we compare the H1N1 pandemic to COVID-19.
Yeah, okay, cool. We have I was just going to post another thing encouraging everyone to please submit any questions you have to the Q&A. We had one actually about the book that you referenced, that when you said, if you shook me awake at 3 a.m., the best text was. What Bethany wants to know what it was.
Yeah, the book is called The Invention of World Religions, and the author is Tomoko Masuzawa, Masuzawa.
Cool. Maybe we can later send that out to everyone.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, did I see another question in the Q&A? I guess, yeah, I don't think we have any other questions at this moment, but everyone should feel free to keep submitting them, and we'll be able to get to more of them at the end.
Great. Awesome. All right. Well, getting into the good stuff, the actual comparing the religious responses. I thought I would start out with theological opposition to quarantine, largely because I think it's the most high profile of these. And so just starting out with a case study of Washington, D.C., we can get a play-by-play of day by day, or at least over the course of the month, exactly what was happening in the city. So very similar to today, a lot of the quarantines and governmental responses were happening at either the state or the local level. Many of these states included places of worship in their bans on public gatherings. Not all states did. The state of Massachusetts, for example, did not, although many houses of worship chose to voluntarily close as part of the larger ban on public gatherings. In Washington, D.C., we see a ban on public gatherings starting on October 4th, and then on October 29th, an announcement that services may resume beginning in November. And it's not until the ban is expanded to include outdoor gatherings that we start to get some opposition in local newspapers. And I've highlighted two clips here. I think what's kind of interesting and important to note about these two clips, though, is that neither of them are advocating for violating policy, but rather advocating for shifting policy. The upper right-hand corner one using kind of a critical framing of the response, kind of using kind of a little bit of an anti-modernist lens, kind of the idea that prayer, having any efficacy in the physical world was an idea that was given no hospitality by the commissioners. And then the bottom anonymous letter kind of just largely more talking about the role that they see religious services playing in the public health response to H1N1. There were, however, a few formal violations of quarantines. So on the left-hand side, an example from Cincinnati, Ohio, a Catholic priest violating quarantine by continuing to hold service. It's important to note, though, I have in the description, the paper reported widespread indignation against Scholl, with, quote, dignitaries of the Catholic Church joining the protest against the disregard of an order that was issued to safeguard the health of the community. On the right-hand side in Los Angeles, there was a group of Christian scientists, a form of charismatic Christianity that also kind of emphasizes faith healing through prayer, were arrested for violating a prohibition on outdoor gatherings after unsuccessfully petitioning the church to be excluded from that ban. Those appeals were, the convictions, the arrests were upheld several weeks later by an appeals court. I think we can kind of contrast that against some of the responses we're seeing today. One of the most high profile ones is coming out of central Louisiana, a suburb of Baton Rouge. This is Tony Spell of the Life Tabernacle Church, who was given several misdemeanors for opening his church during a Louisiana state quarantine and ban on public gatherings, and then was also arrested for aggravated assault for driving a bus dangerously close to a set of protesters. And when he was released, he essentially kind of tried to create a high-profile showing, had a bunch of his congregants come in, not wearing masks, they're pictured below, recording him giving a sermon outside of the courthouse, where he says, quote, "I want to give hope to every Christian in this nation. Today, you don't let anyone take away your rights to go to church. You stand strong and don't ever forget Jesus Christ is the world's savior." And I think that's kind of demonstrates a number of differences that we're seeing between 1918 and today. So again, 1918, very, very few kind of formal violations, and mostly critiques of quarantine are coming in the forms of pleas about the public health role that churches can play in the pandemic. Whereas today, we see much more explicit forms of libertarian anti-statism embedded into these resistance movements, many more kind of performative violations that are intended to be kind of sensationalized by the media, and then also more support from far-right religious organizations. The Liberty Council, which is listed as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, is now representing Tony Spell in his charges. Another example to kind of bring up is from New York City in late April. A group of Haredi Jews led a funeral service in New York City. And kind of what I want to just really highlight here is actually Mayor Bill de Blasio's response, because it's been really, really heavily critiqued as reducing American Judaism to a singularity. My message to the Jewish community. Even though Haredi Judaism is a very, very small community within American Judaism, it's sometimes called ultra-Orthodox Judaism, although that term's seen as derisive by Haredi Jews. But I think this kind of really speaks to that second point of the Religious Literacy Project, that religions are internally diverse rather than uniform, that we can't be speaking of the Jewish community in a singularity because there is so much diversity within it, and kind of a religiously literate response to some of these things needs to involve an understanding of kind of the theological dimensions of what's going on and the specificities of the communities that it's working in. And so while the New York example gives us an important kind of way to think about internal diversity, I think the Central Louisiana example also gives us a way to think about that religious literacy project framing about change over time, that religions are historically dynamic and are shaped and informed by their historical moment. Another example that we can look at is religious participation in relief efforts. So here I have two examples of mask drives, one from a group of Catholic nuns in Oakland, California, and another by a group of Buddhist women in Salt Lake City, Utah. I think kind of an interesting kind of important thing to kind of keep in mind with this is that this also gives us a way to start thinking about some of the gender dimensions of what's going on in 1918 as well. In the early 1900s, religious leadership across religious denominations is still often articulated in very male and masculine terms. Convents and nuns actually have a really interesting role in the history of gender in the United States, and there's a lot of historiography about kind of convents as sites of resistance to or sites of anxieties about gender coming out throughout American history. But kind of just seeing these again as examples, we can look at the role that women who are usually denied religious leadership can still play, both in kind of auxiliary groups or in convents, and in these kind of social reform and relief efforts. Similarly, kind of today, religious participation and relief efforts, here's kind of three examples that I was able to find. There's obviously a ton of them, but a quick example in New York City, a group of Sikhs responded to a call from an organization, United Sikhs, to provide support for those in their communities who are in need. And they responded by creating 30,000 meal kits in their local Gurdwara to give out to the New York City community at large. In the center in Atlanta, two organizations, Project South, an anti-poverty coalition, and then the Hunger Coalition of Atlanta, partnered together with local churches and synagogues to provide mutual aid to local residents. And then on the right-hand side in Boston, these are actually two alumna of Harvard Divinity School who are now operating as interfaith chaplains at Mass General Hospital. And I think kind of each of these three examples also gives us a sense of that third point from the Religious Literacy Project, that religious traditions are embedded in culture. So the Boston example, individuals are not necessarily institutionally affiliated while doing religious work. In the center example, individuals are not necessarily religiously affiliated in order to be doing work located in religious institutions. And then in the New York example, looking at the ways in which a particular community is providing mutual aid outside of their particular religious community into the broader network of New York City. And so again, kind of using this all to keep in mind the ways that religions are also embedded in culture as well. Third, I think is particularly interesting, which is reimagining ritual practice. This first comes from Louisville, Kentucky. So when churches shut down in Louisville, the Courier Journal suggested that a number of ministers write sermonettes or mini sermons that can be read aloud from home. And so this one in particular I thought was interesting, Churchless Church, not only because it is a sermonette, but it also kind of used the sermonette as a space to reflect on the term church itself as it's used in the Christian Testament. So he begins with a quote from 1 Ephesians, and then goes through kind of thinking about the category of church. And I think that highlighted paragraph, this is no argument against houses of worship, but it is a demonstration that while a building may promote, as it usually does, the well-being of a church, it is not necessary to its existence. So this idea of kind of expanding the category of church and thinking about kind of the ethical and theological underpinnings of the thing that we're calling church and what it means at this particular historical moment. That example comes from kind of a change that was occurring during isolation, but there's also examples of kind of long-term shifts in ritual practice as a result of the H1N1 pandemic as well. So this example comes from a 1921 mailer from the LDS Church. LDS, Latter-day Saints, often popularly called Mormons, although that term is not being used as much within that community anymore, or preferring the term Latter-day Saints. But for a large component of LDS history, communion was taken through a common cup. As part of the kind of progressive era reforms around things like sanitation, there was a movement away from a common cup and toward individual communion goblets or communion glasses. This was accepted by the LDS Church in 1912, but not a lot of wards, houses of worship, and religious communities kind of made that transition outside of Salt Lake City. And so this mailer from 1921 is kind of advocating for the expansion of the use of these individual serving cups instead of a common cup. And this is a direct result of the concerns around sanitation that emerged out of H1N1. And so this is just one example of a kind of long-term shift in ritual practice that occurred as a result of H1N1. Today, we obviously have a number of technological innovations that make virtual ritual practices a lot more common. So obviously Skype, obviously Zoom, but even more kind of interesting examples. So Animal Crossing is honestly, I feel like a bad millennial. I don't really know a ton about Animal Crossing. I know that it's a video game. I know that it's an interactive video game. I think you're like on an island. You can bring other users onto your island. Iftar is the term that's used in Islam during the month of Ramadan. One fasts during the day, and then after sunset, one is able to break the fast with a meal, which is called the iftar. It's often a site of family or kind of community engagement. And so because self-isolation really limits those opportunities, things like Animal Crossing even become spaces for people to engage in that meal. And then also if you have a PlayStation virtual reality headset, you can also participate in the VR Church, which is an exclusively virtual reality religious space. Here is a screenshot from them doing a special baptism during self-isolation. And you can see the avatars all participating in the baptism. There's, again, kind of going to be a lot of politics of authenticity that come out of this, but we're seeing a number of kind of shifts to virtual formats occurring during self-isolation today. So the reason that I spent so much time kind of prefacing these questions about modernism is because this is something that we see a lot of both in 1918 and also today. So this is an example from a Presbyterian pastor in Indianapolis who tells his masked congregation, "Science has failed. While the forces of sanitation are perplexed, why not call the greatest moral and religious forces of the Church of Jesus Christ to gather and plead with God?" So this idea of intercessionary prayer as responding to the ongoing failures of science. On the flip side of that, here's an example of a Methodist minister from Birmingham, Alabama. And you can see in his letter to the editor a number of indications. So things like intelligent Christianity, practical religion, really, really signaling that participation and kind of the modernist commitment to reconcile recent forms of knowledge production and information with the Christian faith. And I think the central highlight here is particularly interesting. It is the duty of Christianity to join our civil authorities in an effort to stamp out disease of every kind, and hereby waive our people from the results of sinful neglect and ignorance. So this very idea of kind of anti-modernist critiques of science and sanitation policy as a sinful neglect. Another example from the kind of more modernist side of things comes from Washington, D.C. So we know that Washington, D.C. opens back up the first weekend of November. Here, Francis Grimke gives a sermon, which he then later circulates in a leaflet, so it goes much more broadly than just his particular congregation. Francis Grimke, a very, very significant minister from the late 1800s and early 1900s, he's instrumental in helping to found the NAACP, a Black civil rights organization, in 1909. And this kind of left-hand side highlight that I have, what this means, I do not know. How far we may expect this immunity under such circumstances, I do not know. I think is important. So he's reflecting on a quote from Psalms. And this kind of, I think, gives us a sense of kind of that crisis of the social gospel optimism of the day, that when World War I broke out and then when the H1N1 pandemic emerged almost immediately at the end of World War I, this idea of kind of, I don't want to completely reject the long-held faith commitments that I've had, but I also have a much more kind of reserved response to some of the things I'm seeing because it's so difficult to reconcile current events with the kind of optimism of modernism. And then also kind of pushing it into that still kind of ideas about reform and ideas about meaning making. He also spends a large amount of time thinking about the H1N1 pandemic in relation to currents of racism in the United States at this time, such as Jim Crow. One of the kind of myriad justifications for racism among white Americans during this time was the notion that white people are inherently more healthy than people of color. And so he is using these kind of rhetorical questions of what value has white skin been during these weeks of suffering and death. God has been trying in a really very pronouncedly conspicuous and rigorous way to beat a little sense into the white man's head. And so this idea of kind of finding some form of divine meaning in the pandemic is something that we're seeing on kind of the modernist side as well. On the today, so here's kind of two examples. One is from Fort Worth. Kenneth Copeland is a prosperity gospel televangelist. And you can see on the screenshot here that he calls for a supernatural heat wave to kill the coronavirus. In another sermon, he's told people infected with the coronavirus to place their hands or their head against their television set, and he would be able to divinely heal them from COVID-19. On the right-hand side, we have Rodney Howard-Browne, who is a Pentecostal evangelist and conspiracy theorist who has often appeared on InfoWars. He was arrested in Tampa for reopening his church in violation of city and state ordinances. And also kind of claims these divine intercessionary abilities in a way that's similar to Kenneth Copeland. Again, kind of keeping in mind internal diversity, though, we also have a number of Christians, and particularly Christian evangelicals, embracing scientific responses to COVID-19. So here is from Walter Kim, the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, who runs a Presbyterian church in Charlottesville, Virginia, who talks about the scientific community and people of faith serving as collaborators rather than standing in tension with one another. So again, these kind of the internal diversity of our religious traditions and how that internal diversity can be recognized kind of in relation to debates about modernism. And then everybody's favorite, apocalypticism. So these kind of apocalyptic ideas of pandemics as being one of the indications of the 7 last plagues in the book of Revelation is, I think, not as common yet in the early 1900s. They really start to kind of pick up in the mid-20th century, this kind of apocalyptic thinking. But we do, of course, still very much see it. This is from a Baptist minister in San Francisco, California. Today, if you literally just do a Google search for coronavirus apocalypse, you will get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites talking about whether the coronavirus is one of the plagues in the book of Revelation, if it's a signal of the end of time. I think what's kind of interesting, though, is kind of, I was just perusing some of these, and it seems like a lot of the articles do not say definitively, yes, this is absolutely one of the plagues. Yes, we are absolutely in one of the end of times. They're a lot more ambivalent about that decision. But I think what it does speak to is a recurring theme that's also coming out in this, which is a more recent one that actually pulls from religious responses to the HIV and AIDS epidemic that began in the 1980s, which is this broader idea of what historian Anthony Petro calls a moral epidemic. So that epidemics should be seen as indications of God's wrath, either against the particular individuals who are infected, as was the case for a lot of conservative responses to HIV and AIDS, or God's wrath against a society that countenances large amounts of sin. And so here we have Ralph Drollinger, who is a retired professional basketball player and the current leader of the White House Bible Study Group, a study group sponsored by 10 cabinet members, which holds weekly meetings each Wednesday in the White House, who is speaking about God's wrath in relation to COVID-19. Something kind of important to keep in mind too is that these kinds of claims also draw from and reproduce racist tropes while they're kind of engaging in this theological speculation. Again, thinking about internal diversity, a number of people have kind of come out against these kinds of claims. For example, the Asian American Christian Collaborative is a primarily conservative, theologically conservative evangelical community of Asians and Asian Americans who have spoken out directly against Drollinger and against what they see to be kind of increasing indications of xenophobia and anti-Asian racism built into some of the responses to COVID-19. And of course, this also builds on other forms of anti-religious responses too. So forms of anti-Semitism, forms of Islamophobia, also coming out of some of these claims of apocalypticism or kind of anxieties about the theological meaning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I know I said I had 5, but I also have a secret surprise 6th that I think is something that we really are starting to see in COVID-19 that we haven't really seen that much of in H1N1. And I think largely this is in response to the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s. This can be a little bit of a plug for the next night school talk, which is going to more directly deal with neoliberalism. But this idea that it is ethically viable to profit directly from the pandemic is something that has become a lot more common, I think, in contemporary responses to our pandemic than those that we've seen from H1N1. So to give kind of just 2 quick examples, the first comes from Jim Bakker, who was a famous televangelist in the 80s and 90s, who mostly focuses on the end of times and emergency survivalism. He was actually convicted of fraud in 1991, had a number of sexual misconduct investigations made against him, went off the air for a little while, came back in the late aughts, and now runs a megachurch in southern Missouri. He has recently been sued by the Missouri Attorney General for hawking colloidal silver as a panacea that will, quote, totally eliminate the coronavirus in 12 hours. On the flip side, we also have right here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard Divinity School offering spiritual resources for living through crisis at a rate of $1,200. So I did the math, and actually that would come to about $81 an hour for your participation in this. And if you don't include breakout groups or conversations from participants or the optional spiritual practice, it comes to $252 an hour. So however you break it down, a significant cost. And I want to have a kind of a few qualifications here. First, obviously, the Bakker example is a bad faith effort to be providing aid and resources to a community. But I think there are, and the second kind of point is that also just there's a number of questions that are still out there about kind of how we value our labor and how we receive compensation for our labor that also need to be kind of live questions. What I think I'm trying to drive home here is how normalized the idea of a profit motive has become as part of mutual aid or community support efforts. That institutional contexts and the ethical values of institutions kind of create the conditions where a profit motive becomes, if not a central consideration, at least an ethically viable consideration, something that's meaningful for us. And I think this is kind of particularly concerning in the Divinity School case. One, not only because kind of the role of the humanities in post-COVID higher education is still a really, really significant ongoing question. And so issues of not only kind of classism here, but also that it's kind of detrimental to demonstrating the role that the humanities can provide during times of crisis is, I think, a really significant concern, as was as I think is the concern of kind of contrasting this against the number of free resources, publicly available resources that are available from Harvard Divinity School students, as well as the HGSU that has been putting on mutual aid work, has been providing teaching resources throughout the throughout the coronavirus pandemic that we have today. And so kind of contrasting the resources that are being provided from people who are in much different financial circumstances than divinity school faculty is, I think, something to keep in mind about the kind of underlying profit motive of some of these responses as well. So I tried to keep it short. I went well over. Thank you all for sticking through this with me. I'm more than happy to stay for as long as there are questions. So please feel free to ask any questions, stay as long as you would like. And also thank you so much again to the HGSU-UAW for all of your amazing work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. I think it was well worth it. Yeah, so I think I might turn it over. I don't know if you'd prefer to look at the Q&A questions yourself, or Camille might be able to read them out loud to you.
Yeah, Camille, I'm having trouble finding it. So
might be a panel at the bottom, but
oh, right, of course, the thing that says Q&A.
But I can also read them out loud if we think that adds an extra dynamic. It's fun.
Sure. Well, I'll just start kind of looking down. So Hannah Osman, hello, has a super specific question about observing communion. I haven't looked into this a ton, but what I have seen is a few instances of ministers reporting in local newspapers that they are willing to go to people's houses to offer communion. I think that was kind of specific to some particular theological traditions. I don't think that's kind of across the board, but I did see that in a couple of the things that I read. So I don't know exactly how kind of across the board people were dealing with the question of communion, but I do know for at least a couple traditions, there was interest in providing kind of more individual level communion offerings in individual homes. So hopefully that answers the question a bit.
Yeah, I think maybe what we can do is have one person read the question out loud for everyone who isn't looking at the Q&A. And cool. Yeah, do you want to do that still, Camille? And then that way.
I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I'm ready. I'm all ready. Okay, cool. I'll just start at the top if that's okay then. Yeah?
Yeah.
Sure. Cool. All right. Anonymous viewer asks, how does info being released through print media or newspapers versus social media or other online content affects the public narrative and experience through the two pandemics?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I will say kind of, I do not have as strong of a media studies background as a number of my colleagues in religious studies who could definitely speak better to that. I think this is kind of my own plug for media studies as a really important component of contemporary scholarship. Just recognizing kind of the role that particularly internet and social media have played in reshaping human life in recent years. I think we need a lot more scholarship to be able to understand in meaningful ways. And so I think partly this is just me saying, great question, we need a plug for thinking about that a little bit more. But I think kind of one answer that I can give is that what I did look at and I didn't see at all was kind of national level newspapers or kind of major newspapers like the New York Times weren't reporting these very small violations of quarantine. The Catholic pastor in Cincinnati, the Christian Scientists in LA. Those were kind of reported by local newspapers, but not even kind of state level large newspapers or nationally renowned newspapers at these times. And so I think that kind of opens its own question about the ways in which contemporary media have a tendency to kind of sensationalize what seem like otherwise discrete violations of quarantine orders that then kind of have a snowballing effect of expanding criticism of and opposition to these kinds of orders. Again, I think somebody with a much stronger media studies background would be able to have a much more intellectual answer to that, but that was kind of just off the top of my head one of the things that I did notice.
Cool. From Sarah, we have how prevalent were conspiracy theories around the time of the H1N1 pandemic?
Yeah, another great question. I didn't see in the research that I did in the last couple of weeks, I didn't see conspiracy theories. I think also I was looking at local newspapers. And so things like letters to the editor could be places where we might see conspiracy theories. It's either the case that kind of I wasn't looking in the right places for these conspiracy theories, or that they weren't as prevalent at this time. So I think the only answer I can give you to that one is that in the research I did, which was by no means comprehensive, but I think kind of a decent amount, I didn't really see conspiracy theories coming up in really, really significant ways. One qualification to that, I would say, is that you do see some forms of racist backlash that I think we could kind of vaguely classify as conspiracy theories. Most notoriously in Chicago, there was an argument that African Americans migrating from the US South into Chicago as part of what's called the Great Migration of the early 1900s. There was misinformation that African American migrants were the main communicators of H1N1. That was not the case. It was spread through military officials, but that kind of misinformation was definitely in the water, and was predominantly along racial lines.
Cool. Jason O'Malley asks, what are your thoughts on any disparities in understanding of personal rights at different time periods and any intersectionality with religious identity that may apply?
Yeah, that's another great question. It's an interesting one too. I think kind of just, so it's not until the kind of the 1940s that we start to see contemporary religious liberty law emerge. There's something called the Incorporation Doctrine, which really reshapes American religious liberty law at this time. And so before the 1940s, most religious liberty law was not being adjudicated at the federal level. It was mostly being adjudicated at the state level. And so something like the Christian Scientists trying to provide an appeal, it'd be really, really hard to see that reaching the Supreme Court because it would be seen exclusively as a state level concern. I think because of that, ideas about, this isn't so much an answer to the question of individual rights, but kind of a question about how these kinds of things might be adjudicated, because I think kind of questions about religious liberty and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly become really live questions in some of the ways that people are trying to impose quarantine right now. So I think kind of at least recognizing that the legal dynamics that are at play shift in really particular ways after the H1N1 pandemic can kind of give us at least a bit of a sense of how and why the questions about religious liberty seem to be so live today in a way that they weren't necessarily as live of concerns in 1918. The individual rights element, I know religious liberty is just kind of one component of that. That I'm not as sure about, and it would be kind of a great question to dig in with the kind of legal history dynamic a little bit more directly.
Cool. Question from the. I heard that religious beliefs have played important roles in past plagues in the sense that people have specific theories regarding where the disease comes from and how to cure it. This aspect of religion seems to have largely been marginalized. People who claim that they're covered by Jesus's blood, for example, and are therefore immune to the disease are generally not taken seriously today. Was the situation different in 1918, and if so, in what way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it gets to kind of the heart of that kind of modernist controversy that I was talking about on the earlier side of the presentation. So in this kind of late 1800s, early 1900s is a time when we really have the solidification of what gets called modernity. So like Western modernity as a concept, as kind of the bringing together of kind of Enlightenment currents of rationalism and empiricism to claim kind of a coherent way to understand and experience the world. And that gets called modernity. And so the modernism debates are really about the extent to which Christianity can be reconciled with these emerging ideas of modernity, or whether Christianity stands opposed to these currents of modernity. And that goes for other traditions as well. And so examples of kind of being covered in Jesus's blood and kind of forms of evidentiary reasoning or forms of divine intercession or forms of understandings of the natural world that don't follow from empiricism or rationalism or those other kind of like Enlightenment currents are seen as inconsistent with modernity and therefore childish or foolish, right? And so I think kind of 1918 was a time in which we still have that kind of golden age of liberal theology kind of coming to its end, the chastening effect of World War I, but at the same time, the kind of going line of liberal theology kind of still being the dominant discourse of the day, particularly within Christianity, I think gives kind of those people who are more willing to countenance modernity and modernist precepts the kind of rule of the day, but the kind of currents that push past that, who are looking at faith healing, that are looking at forms of charismatic practice, so like early Pentecostalism, for example, as kind of different ways of responding to that. And so that would be kind of my sense of kind of what the general vibe was for the historical moment. But by and large, again, we're seeing a huge amount of diversity and the kind of different patterns of responses to those questions about modernism, I think kind of really shape and inform what end up being called our kind of culture wars that we think of from the 1990s to today.
Great. I want to read out a quick comment from Jason Loss. I'm not sure where in the talk this came up, where this was raised, because I think it was in the chat, but in the Jewish spaces my family participated in, they emphasized the story of the 10 plagues, particularly as it was Passover, analogizing particularly plague number 10, it as the stay-at-home order.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And so this kind of thinking in parallels, this notion of kind of texts from the Hebrew Bible, narratives from the Hebrew Bible as applying to or providing kind of metaphorical understandings of kind of contemporary events, both in kind of a metaphorical sense and then also for some evangelical apocalypticists, a more literal sense as well. They're more focused in Revelation than in the Hebrew Bible, but in the book of Revelations than in the Hebrew Bible. But I think a kind of similar way to kind of think about and analogize narratives from sacred texts into our contemporary moment. So very helpful. Thank you.
And now a question from Jason. How much has the theology of civil disobedience influenced the modern resistors? It feels like a perverse inversion of the theology associated with the civil rights movement.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think kind of resistance to the state doesn't always necessarily need to take the form of what we call civil disobedience. And so it may be more helpful to think of kind of resistance to the state as a broader kind of set of ways to relate to the state, of which civil disobedience provides one. But I think kind of, Jason, what you're pointing to, which I think is important, is a way in which conservative white evangelicals today have a tendency to narrativize their experience as being oppressed by the state and therefore needing liberation from the state. So kind of drawing from and kind of creatively appropriating civil rights discourse, liberation theology discourse in their own theological understandings of themselves, of their tradition, and of their relation to the state, I think kind of creates these conditions for it to sound a lot like civil disobedience for the creation of greater formations of justice. We saw that a lot in kind of Hobby Lobby, for example, in the Supreme Court case from 2014. I'm not sure how much that kind of helps to answer your question, but may give a little bit of a sense of how to start thinking about the ways in which kind of people are invoking themselves as providing theological foundations for resistance movements to the state broadly.
Great. And now from Carolyn, who presented with us 2 weeks ago now, I think it was. How did the perceived opposition between science and religion change the responses of religious communities both in 19 and today?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think something that I read recently, which I found helpful, was a kind of way to think about this that isn't necessarily kind of science versus religion, but rather science as the kind of terrain against which theological notions of evidentiary reasoning and understandings of the world and empiricist forms of evidentiary reasoning and understanding of the world kind of play out. And so it's not necessarily the most helpful to think of kind of science versus religion, but rather how questions of science, questions about how we understand the natural world, can be shaped by competing truth claims, theological truth claims, empirical truth claims, and how they kind of can relate to one another and how they can kind of stand in tension with one another. And that kind of, I think, again, a particular kind of pattern of that relationship creates a sense of opposition. So the perceived opposition that you're talking about between science and religion is one that's kind of absolutely coming out, in 1918 as well as today. So the example of that Indianapolis Star editorial that says kind of science has failed, I think that was the San Francisco one, where science has failed and we need religion to come back and kind of replace forms of scientific reasoning, because these forms of theological reasoning about divine intercession, the nature of disease and epidemic, will be more meaningful and more viable and provide a better response than the scientific empirical claims that are being developed from the so-called sanitation experts, which was the name that was used a lot in the early 1900s. Hopefully that answers that question. I know that's a much more complex question that I very much glossed. And I feel like I should have a giant asterisk after everything. It's much more complicated than I just said, but I think that's a general gist.
Cool. We have Courtney on Sam Kieser's account, both recent Div School students. Did you come across anything with regard to religious exemptions during the 1918 flu pandemic, or anything similar to the way state Supreme Courts are striking down stay-at-home orders now? I think Courtney studies religious exemptions, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And great to see HDS folks in the mix as well. I would say that kind of, there definitely were religious exemptions. So again, kind of at state and local level, quarantine orders, there were some exemptions made for houses of worship. So in the state of Massachusetts, for example, there were a number of houses of worship were exempt from the quarantine orders. A number of houses of worship, regardless, decided to close down voluntarily, even though they were not compelled to by state or local quarantine orders. In terms of that kind of, in similar to the ways that the state Supreme Courts are striking down stay-at-home orders now, I don't see that happening. I didn't see that happening earlier on. I think what may be helpful to kind of qualify this, though, is that we need to remember that for most of that second wave, we were still in World War I. And during World War I, President Wilson, strong restrictions on freedom of the press, kind of strong restrictions on popular dissent and freedom of speech. And so we were in a historical moment in which state power was consolidating, and opposition to state power was almost always configured as therefore opposition to war and therefore opposition to the survival of the United States. And so I think because of that kind of conceptual framing of what opposition is like, we probably have a much more chilling effect on the nature and kind of oppositions to state power than what we would see today. I think would be kind of an important qualification to keep in mind on that. But it's a good question. It'd be interesting to see kind of looking at parts of the country where there were quarantine orders that included houses of worship, where there weren't, and kind of if there were patterns of responses that we were seeing as a result of that, and the kind of voluntary nature of church closings.
Yeah, cool. All right. As of now, this is our last question in the Q&A function, but feel free to add them as long as Eric's okay with that. Leo asks, as COVID-19 continues to play out and the pandemic develops, what religious dimensions are you tracking most closely? What religious studies work do you think interested people should be looking out for in this time?
Great question. Leo is a close friend of mine who lives in DC. So hello, thank you for coming from far away. It's a good question. I mean, to kind of go backwards, so kind of things to be looking out for and keeping in mind, I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to really understand the nature and impact of this kind of modernist, anti-modernist controversy of kind of throwing the chips up in American religious denominations, and then kind of falling in particular patterned ways. I think there's enough historical work out there to recognize this was a very important, this kind of 1870s to 1910s, a really, really important time in American religious history, with a lot of theological innovations, a lot of theological debates, a lot of theological tensions, but looking at the kind of long-term effects and ramifications, I don't think we have done enough to really fully understand, particularly, again, once we get to kind of the development of new media, social media, the kind of post-truth moment that we see in the wake of 2016. I think those are all still really open and live questions as well. The dimensions that I am tracking most closely, I go through like fits and spurts of just kind of like completely anxiety prone refusal to engage the news and like immediate aggressive deep dives of all day engagement with the news. So I don't know if there's particular dimensions that I'm tracking most closely, since I have such a chaotic relationship to the news right now. But I think kind of one, I guess, if this is a reframing of the question a little bit, but one thing that's I think interesting to also keep in mind is throughout the 20th century, there's a huge developing relationship between conservative Christian, particularly evangelical, but conservative Christian theology and capitalism. So, for example, the fundamentals, the books, the essays that I referenced that led to the development of fundamentalism was financed by an oil tycoon. There's a really, really interesting book by Kevin Cruz called One Nation Under God, and the subtitle is How Corporate America Invented Christian America. And it essentially kind of looks at the role of corporate institutions during the Great Depression, trying to respond to and be critical of the New Deal in ways that tried to pull in conservative evangelical theology, particularly conservative evangelical understandings of the state and the role of the state to kind of create this libertarian anti-statism. And so a really deep and intricate connection that has both theological dimensions and also just kind of strategic political dimensions, kind of connecting the quote unquote anti-modernist white religious conservatives who are critical of the kind of modernizing state, and also the capitalist interests that were concerned about the rise of a social welfare state, kind of both consolidating at the same time, creating a kind of strategic alliance. And I think there's a number of ways that we start to see that playing out today with anxieties about the American economy as a result of quarantines. So I think what would be interesting is kind of more work being done on that intersection of conservative white evangelicalism and capitalism, and particularly how that is shaping and informing some of the claims about economic reopenings and anxieties about economic stagnation and recession that are coming out right now too.
Great. That was wonderful. So that's it for what we have in the function. If anyone has anything else, maybe speak up now.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was wonderful. And thanks for staying on to answer questions too.
Absolutely, yeah, and thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you for staying with me. I practiced earlier today, and I was like, I got it down to 45 minutes. We're like ready for a good 15-minute Q&A, and then went wildly over the time frame, even dropping some of my talking points. So thank you all for staying with me for so long and for all of your great questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric, for staying on past the hour too to answer all the great questions. Yeah, so we did record this. We'll be sending out the recording link to everyone. And next week, we have one more presentation lined up from Aparna from Anthropology, who's going to be talking about public health in Kerala, a state in India, and how outcomes there have compared to outcomes in other places that are economically better off, and why that is. So yeah, there'll be a really interesting talk. And then the week after that, we're doing a roundtable discussion with all 6 night school presenters. We're also asking people to submit questions in advance for that roundtable at the sign-up link, tinyurl.com/COVID Night School. So yeah, we have a couple more really interesting talks lined up, and we hope to see you next week.